The views and opinions expressed on this public access program do not necessarily represent those of the H Hawaii Media family of radio stations.
It's time for Sunday morning public access programming on this H Hawaii Media radio station.
All right, great to have you along on this Sunday morning. I'm Johnny Miro. It's time for our Sunday morning public access programming on our 5 Oahu radio stations here with H Hawaii Media. We also have 4 on Maui and the island of Kauai. And another topic of discussion that revolves around local items, local issues. This one's very interesting because it's been talked about for a few years now. And it's dealing with new technology, modes of transportation. And saw an article a few years back, and I just brought it forward once again, that Sylvie brought up about the electric sea gliders being able to transport people from island to island, the super ferry in the sky. And also recently it's been brought up in discussion via the folks at Grassroots Institute of Hawaii. And joining me to discuss that and maybe some other matters concerning the electric sea gliders and the company behind that and maybe some of the regulations or lack thereof is Jonathan Helton from Grassroots Institute. He's a policy analyst over there and a very busy young man. Appreciate him spending some time with us this Sunday morning. Jonathan, good morning to you.
Johnny, good morning to you. Thanks for having me on the show.
All right, the futuristic topic, but you know what? It's 2026 already. We have to start looking to new modes of transportation that, can, evolve. Will it evolve safely? Will it evolve without rules and regulations slowing down the progress of that? And we're talking about these electric sea gliders. Now, the governor just signed a bill related to sea gliders, but before we get any further on that, how would you describe the technology and what makes it different from both airplanes and ferries?
The picture that I would want someone to put in their mind when they think of a sea glider is a combination between a seaplane and a hydrofoil. So basically how it works is that a sea glider will start in the water like a seaplane would, and then it sort of takes off with a hydrofoil and then gets above the water, nowhere near as much as a normal airplane would, and it may be 60 feet off of the surface of the ocean, and that's how it flies. And so, I would encourage someone to go, if you're having a hard time envisioning that, go look up a video of it. They're very cool, very futuristic, as you said. And so, I think one of the real reasons people are looking at this is because of aerodynamics and some of the science that I am personally not an expert on. Sea gliders are able to have a much lower fuel cost than a normal airplane because of some of what they call the ground effect from flying so close to the surface of the ocean.
And I was trying to see the company involved. Is this still the company that the Civil Beat story had, Surf Air Mobility? Are they the ones based out of the West Coast, or is this a company from the East Coast?
Yes, the most recent company that has been looking at having sea gliders in Hawaii is called Regent. They might have a partnership with that other company, and they've probably, frankly, changed names a couple of times over the past couple of years.
Yeah, so Surf Air Mobility was the latest one. So it's possible. Regent Craft, Regent Craft out of Boston. There you go.
Yeah.
And possibly sometime by later this year, early 27, with some more test sea gliders. In the meantime, it was SB 2400, I believe, that the governor signed off on. Can you explain that?
That's correct. And so what that bill did, and the reason the Grassroots Institute supported it, is it clarified what regulations the state will apply to sea gliders. Listeners might know any sort of shipping operation that is moving goods between the islands and Hawaii must get an approval from the Public Utilities Commission. And right now, there are only 2 companies that have approval to move people or goods inter-island. And those companies are Young Brothers, which moves just about all of the cargo, and then also the Expeditions Ferry that will take people from Maui to Lanai. And so because sea gliders initially start out in the water when they're taking off, there was a real question, based on how state law was worded, about whether or not they would be subject to the same regulations that normal, boats and barges are subject to. And so basically all the bill did is it just clarified, no, wing and ground craft, like a sea glider, that does not have to get approval to be an inter-island water carrier from the Public Utilities Commission.
And that would be the Hawaii Water Carrier Act, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So what's the sales pitch then for the sea gliders? It seems like something like this would be pretty costly and only available for those who could afford kind of a flight between the neighbor islands for a decent price. What's the take and what's the sales pitch for this?
So I'll share the sales pitch that the company Regent has been sharing, and that's first of all that they run on electricity so that they tend to be cleaner and better for the environment.
Yeah.
And second of all, the fuel cost tends to be much lower than for a traditional airplane. So that's the sales pitch they're using. I would include a second one from the perspective of the Grassroots Institute, and that's whenever someone has more options in how they travel, that tends to be a good thing. We see this all of the time. Grassroots talks about the Jones Act a lot. One of the reasons shipping prices are so high from the U.S. mainland, there's only really two carriers that bring things to Hawaii. And you have the same thing in transportation here in terms of looking at the airline market here. There are a limited number of carriers that are moving people inter-island. And if you have some more competition in that market, you're able to see lower prices and better services for everyone.
Let's go back to the SB 2400, and that would be the bill that the governor just signed related to these sea gliders. Anytime possibly you take away some authority as far as regulation is concerned, people might get a little sketchy over safety issues. How are you folks, what's your take on how that thought process goes into it as far as this would not lessen safety oversights with something like this, a sea glider?
Absolutely. This is a real concern because sea gliders are, that's a relatively new technology. Mm-hmm. They're not being used commercially in a lot of places. So are they going to be safe? It's important to note that oversight from the Public Utilities Commission mm-hmm. is not about we're going to inspect your craft and look and make sure that everything is in working order. Public Utility Commission, that's more about a consumer protection from the point of view of how much are you charging people and what are your routes going to be. So this exemption from PUC regulation is not an exemption from safety rules. Safety rules are going to be determined by either the Coast Guard or the Federal Aviation Administration. Mm. And there was a really big question at the federal level, who is going to regulate these? Because again, just like the question here in Hawaii, is this a boat? Is this a plane? Well, eventually, Congress decided, okay, the regulator is going to be the Coast Guard. That's a very recent development, actually. This was in early May. Congress passed in one of its budget bills some funding to provide the Coast Guard the money to be the regulator for these wing and ground craft. So all of your safety regulations, that's going to be federal, that's going to be Coast Guard. They're going to be making sure, hey, is this craft in working order?
And going back to, you said PUC would have oversight over costs. Any estimation on what ticket prices would be, or is it way too early for something like that? Because you don't even know the routes for sure. Maybe Lanai and Maui, that's
right.
Yeah.
Personally, I would say it's way too early to know. I know that in some of the marketing material that the company has been using, they've been saying it might be as low as $30 a ticket. Now, will it actually be $30? Completely open question. Most electricity here in Hawaii, it comes from oil, and oil prices have been really high recently. And so even though the plane itself isn't going to be burning, jet fuel, it's going to be affected by that. So I think it totally depends on what the route is going to be and what the price of oil is going to be when they start offering commercial services.
From Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, Jonathan Helton, policy analyst, joining me this morning on Johnny. And if this does happen, if it does come about, if they're commercially viable, in your opinion, what kind of infrastructure would Hawaii need? Are we talking about major new facilities? Can existing harbors and waterfront locations accommodate them?
Yes, I think that's what you're looking at. And I will say one of the things that Grassroots wants everyone to be wary of is that this does not become another super ferry. Having the idea of a super ferry and the additional service and competition it brought that was all well and good. The challenge, though, was that the super ferry was able to get funds from the state of Hawaii to help pay for some of these dock improvements. And so that, they paid for some improvements on Maui and I think some of the other islands. And as a result, taxpayers are actually still paying off some of the bonds for those facilities today.
What?
And, from the perspective of the company, that's a really good deal. From the perspective of the taxpayer, it becomes a very risky bet because this is relatively new technology, and it might not work out. And so from the point of view of Grassroot, we would really like to see the company that is looking to bring these sea gliders into Hawaii and use them be the one that puts up the money for that investment, because they're the ones with the financial incentive to make sure that their services are good and that there are not major safety issues with it, that people like it, that it services routes that are useful. And so the taxpayers and the state of Hawaii, they face a different set of incentives. Mm-hmm. And, frankly, they're not the ones who are best, who are in the best position to make some of those dock investments.
Jonathan Helton from Grassroot Institute of Hawaii. He mentioned super ferry. I don't recall that ever being talked about for emergency response, medical transport, or disaster relief between the islands. Maybe I missed that, but no cargo transport and, of course, passenger transport. They definitely were utilized. What's your take on this technology eventually being used for other services like emergency response, medical transport for the neighbor islands?
I think it definitely holds a lot of promise. The key difference here is speed. These sea gliders can travel much faster. It's much closer to the speed of an airplane than a boat. And so, I think for some of your rural areas, if they do have dock infrastructure, that these sea gliders might be able to supplement some of what, your smaller airlines are doing. I know that Region has announced a partnership with Mokulele, the airline that services, Molokai, Lanai, some of the other rural areas in Hawaii with smaller planes. And so to the extent this could supplement that, it might be easier for a neighbor island resident to get transportation over to Oahu for like a routine medical checkup. Mm-hmm. I don't think that we're going to see or that we're going to see sea gliders replace emergency air transport for someone who's having a heart attack and really needs to be moved to Oahu quickly. I think that your life flights are still going to do that. But to the extent that it offers an additional option, I think it could be very helpful.
All right, let's get back to the PUC. And speaking of that Public Utilities Commission, what happened to that bill to allow young brothers to automatically increase rates? I thought that went into effect at the first of the year. Has that been delayed or has that been in effect? That
bill was signed into law just a couple of weeks ago,
okay.
And it is supposed to go into effect on July 1st of this year.
July 1st.
So we should be seeing in the next couple of weeks the PUC putting out some information on exactly, how much Young Brothers is going to get to increase rates every year, because the bill did not specify that. The bill specified, PUC, you have to follow these general guidelines, but we are going to let you pick the number as long as it's not higher than 5%. And this is actually going to be really interesting to see what the PUC decides to do. Because in testimony on this bill, the PUC was pretty concerned that the legislature was stepping in to create a automatic, rate adjustment by law. I think the PUC would have preferred to retain its authority to grant Young Brothers and all the other water carriers, rate adjustments when they came and requested it through the normal process.
Now, is there anything lawmakers could do to help lower inter-island shipping costs that you folks might have been able to recommend?
I think the biggest thing is to look for more ways to improve competition in the market. As I said earlier, there's just two companies that are in inter-island transportation, and they're not really competing with each other. One's a ferry and one primarily moves cargo. And so, I think one of the challenges here is that Young Brothers does need to make money, and some of the routes in Hawaii, aren't as profitable as others. But on the other hand, Young Brothers doesn't face any competition that would encourage them to improve services, cut costs, respond in a way that businesses respond to a normal market. And part of the reason they don't have any of that competition is because of how hard it would be for any other company to enter illicit market. Pasha tried to do this back in 2009, and they were in the market for about 4 years, moving goods into her island. And during that time period, the legislature actually passed a law that made it even harder for any new company to enter the inter-island transportation market. And so I think if lawmakers are looking for ways to how do we increase competition and maybe lower costs in the long run, the first thing that they should do is they should revisit that 2011 legislation and look at repealing it to make it easier for other companies to come in and compete with Young Brothers.
And this would tie into the sea gliders potentially coming in, because there'd be negative effects with this new technology potentially coming here. Sounds like that would be the case.
Yeah, it looks like the sea gliders are probably going to be serving a different niche. Right now, the prototype that they have is like a 12-passenger vehicle, so they're not going to be hauling a massive amounts of cargo. Maybe in the future, if this works out, there will be sea gliders that do carry cargo. But right now, this will be helpful for moving people, but not really for if you have to ship your car between islands.
All right, Jonathan, what's the biggest obstacles right now? We've mentioned a few, but anything else standing out, the obstacles between today's test phase and then the actual commercial sea glider service operating in Hawaii?
Yeah, I would imagine the obstacles are twofold. One is that the company needs to make sure that it can get its ducks in order in terms of where are we going to land these ships, where are we going to get people on and off. And second of all, it's making sure that everything is lined up with the federal regulations and the Coast Guard. As I said, that change to make sure it was definitely going to be the Coast Guard as the regulator was relatively recent.
Mm-hmm.
So, Regent and all of the other people it's partnered with here in Hawaii, they're going to have to make sure both of those things, are all ironed out before we see any sort of commercial service.
And as we look maybe 5 to 10 years ahead, if everything goes according to plan, very early in the planning stages, how could sea gliders, in your opinion, maybe the folks at Grassroots, how could these sea gliders change the way Hawaii residents think about inter-island travel and connectivity in the year 2026?
I'm going to be an optimist here. 10 years from now, if it's 2036, I would love to see sea gliders and other forms of transportation that we haven't even thought of today
I know.
More common in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Where people have more options. They have better choice between, am I going to take a plane? Am I going to take a sea glider? Am I going to take a ferry? Am I going to take, maybe we'll have flying cars. Who knows? But the goal is how at Grassroots is looking for ways to make that future possible. And a lot of times the regulations that Hawaii has don't allow that kind of innovation. And so that's why we were really excited when we saw this bill at the legislature, because it is clarifying the law to allow for this innovation to happen. So I think that's what we're going to have to do more of if we want to see Hawaii's future as different than it is now.
And since this technology is so new, we don't really have any really hard evidence that the sea gliders could actually deliver on their promises of the affordability, reliability, and environmental benefits, because this is new technology. I don't recall any of the stories saying it's being utilized elsewhere on the East Coast or on the West Coast. It's just in the test phase, right?
That's correct. I know they're looking at maybe trying to have some of these sea gliders in places in Europe, but there's a good possibility that Hawaii will be the first place where they're used commercially. And that could be very exciting for the state in other ways, because then you have people looking to Hawaii to see what can we innovate? How can we innovate in Hawaii? How can we partner with the state government in Hawaii and private businesses in Hawaii to make a product that we can beta test here, and if it goes well, we can export it across the world.
All right, folks, we're talking about the future here. These sea gliders. We had the super ferry that went by the wayside. Sea gliders with all the technology available to us now. That is an incremental step in another mode of transportation between the islands. Speaking of which, you folks are going to be talking story with folks and presenting some an outlook, I guess, for the year. You're doing some talk stories with people in Honolulu and also on the neighbor islands. Can you promote what islands and what time you're going to be there, getting in front of the folks and doing some Q&A and delivering some talk stories?
Absolutely. So if you're listening to this on Sunday morning, on Wednesday, June 17th, we're going to be in Honolulu. You can go to our website, grassrootinstitute.org/events, to register. And we're also going to have an event the next day, Thursday, the 18th, in Kahului. So at both of those events, Grassroots is going to be there. We're going to be sharing about what bills were passed by the legislature this year, what bills didn't pass, and then our outlook for next year.
And the website, once again, for people to get a little wiser. You folks at Grassroots Institute, for all the information.
Yes, that's grassrootinstitute.org.
And your email, I know you mentioned that is available for listeners of this program if they want to reach out to you.
I am always happy to talk story with anyone, talk about sea gliders, we talk about housing regulations, talk about rebuilding in Lahaina. My email is the letter J, Helton, it's Helton, at grassrootinstitute.org.
All right, great stuff, Jonathan. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. You have a great rest of the day, too.
The views and opinions that were expressed on this public access program do not necessarily represent those of the H Hawaii Media family of radio stations.
You've been listening to H Hawaii Media's Sunday morning public access programming. Have a great day.